Here's a fact that should keep you up at night. In September 2006, the IMF's official World Economic Outlook declared that global financial risks were broadly balanced. 18 months later, the world's financial system nearly ceased to exist. The common belief is that crises announce themselves, that smart people will see the cliff before we drive off it. They won't. They never do. This is because the next collapse isn't hiding in a failing bank or a crashing stock market. It is buried inside the architecture of the financial system itself. It lives in a mechanism so deeply embedded that the people running it don't fully understand what they've built. The system has already started breaking. You just can't see it yet. To understand why, we have to look back to 1954 and an economist named Hyman Minsky. He arrived at one of the most unsettling conclusions in the history of economics, which he called the financial instability hypothesis. It suggests a terrifying paradox. Stability itself is the danger. When an economy is stable for a long time, people stop being afraid. When fear disappears, they borrow. At first, it's cautious, but slowly every year of stability makes debt cheaper and lending looser. The system shifts from hedge finance, where income covers principal and interest, to speculative finance, where income only covers interest, and finally to Ponzi finance, where the borrower needs asset prices to keep rising just to stay solvent. Nobody rings a bell when this transition happens. The entire system slides from safe to fragile while everyone congratulates themselves on how stable things look. We have just lived through one of the longest periods of artificial financial stability in recorded history. From 2009 to 2022, interest rates were held near zero. During that window, total global debt rose from roughly $200 trillion to over $315 trillion. This is Minsky's hypothesis executing in real time at a global scale. We're witnessing what Ludwig von Mises called the crack-up boom, a final explosion of borrowing and asset inflation that looks like prosperity right up until the moment it vanishes. This brings us to a mechanism known as the doom loop. In 1931, the collapse of a mid-sized Austrian bank triggered a global meltdown because that bank was connected to everything else. Today, the modern doom loop is bigger and more hidden. Regulations require banks to hold safe assets, which usually means government bonds. This means when you deposit money, you are essentially holding up the government's ability to borrow. Conversely, governments can only service their massive debt because banks are forced to buy their bonds. They are leaning on each other. But when inflation rises and central banks hike rates, the value of those bonds craters. This creates a hole in bank balance sheets. We saw a glimpse of this with the collapse of Silicon Valley Bank, but the problem is systemic. Estimates suggest banks are sitting on hundreds of billions of dollars in unrecognized losses hidden by accounting rules that allow them to ignore market value. Beyond banks and governments, there's a third player: private credit. This is the fastest growing and least transparent corner of finance. In a decade, this market has ballooned to over $2 trillion, fueled by cheap money. Unlike banks, these funds have no lender of last resort. If they get into trouble, they simply stop lending. This creates an immediate existential crisis for the companies depending on them, particularly in commercial real estate. Trillions of dollars in real estate debt is set to mature soon. These loans were written at 3% interest and now must be refinanced at 8 or 9%. The math simply doesn't work. The defaults are already beginning, but the defaults aren't the crisis. The crisis is the fact that these loans serve as collateral for the rest of the system. When the collateral loses value, credit tightens everywhere. Ray Dalio's study of the rise and fall of empires suggests that all major powers operate on a long-term debt cycle of 75 to 100 years. This isn't a short-term recession, it's a deep structural cycle where debt accumulates until the monetary system is strained beyond recovery. The last time this cycle ended was between 1929 and 1945. We are not just approaching the end of a long-term debt cycle, we are inside it. We are in the phase where policymakers apply desperate short-term fixes to long-term structural problems, ensuring that when the reckoning arrives, it is even larger. One clear signal is that the U.S. government now spends more on interest payments than on its entire national defense budget. This isn't a political issue, it's a mathematical one. This leads to what Irving Fisher described as a debt deflation spiral. When debt levels become extreme, borrowers sell assets to raise cash. These sales push prices down, which increases the real burden of the remaining debt. This creates a tightening spiral where the credit system eventually seizes. Credentialed institutions often miss this because they measure current stability rather than accumulating fragility. Today, 15 to 20% of publicly traded companies are zombie corporations. They only survive by rolling over debt because their income doesn't even cover their interest. They are the Ponzi stage of the Minsky model made visible. The final piece of this crisis is the breakdown of diversification. Modern wealth protection assumes that different assets move differently. When stocks fall, bonds should rise. In 2022, that assumption broke. Stocks and bonds fell simultaneously. Because every asset was inflated by the same mechanism of cheap money, they are all exposed to the same unwinding. This is correlation and convergence. When a true systemic shock hits, everything moves downward together. The diversification people count on will fail them at the exact moment they need it most. The Federal Reserve is now structurally compromised. If they cut rates to stop a credit crunch, they risk reigniting inflation. If they keep rates high, they accelerate the collapse of banks and zombie companies. This is the great stagflationary debt crisis, a collision of high debt, high inflation, and low growth. Even the structure of passive investing through index funds adds to the risk. As Michael Burry has pointed out, index funds create an illusion of diversification while actually concentrating assets. In a panic, everything is sold proportionally, making the shock more violent. History shows that the people who survive these moments aren't the ones who predicted the exact timing, but the ones who understood the architecture well enough to know which pieces were load-bearing. The crisis won't look obvious until it's too late because it will begin in an obscure corner of the market and cascade faster than any institution can respond. The ancient Romans watched their silver coins get lighter and more debased every year until they forgot what silver looked like. We must not make the same mistake. History isn't the past, it is a running diagnosis of the present. Right now, the system has a fever, and most people are simply refusing to check the thermometer.